Welcome to the deep dive. We're going deep today into the fascinating world of how we develop, focusing on those crucial years of childhood.
It's going to be a great deep dive.
You've put together a really incredible collection of readings for us, spanning centuries of thought on this, from ancient philosophers to the latest cutting-edge research.
Yeah, it's quite a range.
Our goal today is to trace those big shifts in how we've thought about development, understand those key discoveries, and ultimately come away with a deeper, richer understanding of how children grow and change.
Exactly. And I think it's important to start by grounding our conversation in the biology, like what does development actually mean fundamentally for any living thing?
Yeah, good point.
It's growth, obviously, but it's also that amazing transformation from simple structures to complex ones. Biologists call that differentiation.
Right.
Then there's morphogenesis, which is how a body takes on its ordered form. And of course, there's reproduction, which ensures that traits get passed down and the species continues. And these biological processes were actually what initially sparked the study of developmental psychology back in the late 19th century.
Okay, let's unpack that a bit. One of the things that really struck me in the readings was this ongoing debate about preformation versus epigenesis.
Oh, yeah, that's a big one.
It seems like a fundamental disagreement about how life actually unfolds. Can you tell us more about that?
Absolutely. This debate goes all the way back to Aristotle. He was observing embryos and noticed that new structures seemed to appear during development. And that led to a really fundamental question.
Okay.
Is development simply a matter of pre-existing structures unfolding, sort of like a tiny human just getting bigger, which is preformation? Or is it something more dynamic, where new structures actually emerge along the way, which is epigenesis?
Right, that's a big
It's
difference.
huge. And this debate wasn't just some historical curiosity. It actually laid the groundwork for how we still think about nature versus nurture today. Like, are traits predetermined or are they shaped by our experiences?
That's a good point.
Now, fast forward to the 18th century. Microscopes are becoming more sophisticated and fueling this debate even further. We have the ovists, who believe everything's preformed in the egg.
Okay.
And then you have the spermists, who are convinced it's all in the sperm. I mean, imagine someone drawing a tiny, fully formed human inside a sperm. That's how literally they took preformation.
Wow, a tiny human in a strip. That's quite a visual.
Isn't it? But thankfully, more detailed anatomical studies started to emerge in the late 1700s. People like Caspar Friedrich Wolff were looking at embryos under the microscope and seeing things like tubes actually growing out of flat sheets of tissue.
Huh.
New structures appearing, not just miniature versions getting bigger.
So evidence for epigenesis.
Exactly. And by the end of the 18th century, largely due to the work of Harvey, epigenesis became the dominant view. The idea that growth and shaping happen simultaneously. But as you can imagine, this left a big question hanging.
Which is?
If everything isn't just prepackaged, how does heredity actually work? Like, how are traits passed down if it's not all predetermined?
Right, that makes sense. And this is where Darwin and the whole field of genetics come in, right?
You got it. In the 19th century, Darwin's theory of evolution and then the explosion of genetics research really took center stage in explaining both development and heredity. And interestingly, this actually led to a period where embryology itself became a bit sidelined.
Oh, really? Why is that?
Well, a prominent biologist named Ernst Haeckel popularized this idea that ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny.
Say that again?
Ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. So a
Right.
mouthful, I know. But it basically means that the development of an individual ontogeny mirrors the evolutionary history of its species' phylogeny. So it's like a fast-forward replay of evolution as a baby grows, although we know now it's not quite that straightforward.
So the idea was that as we develop, we go through stages that resemble earlier life forms.
Right. And Haeckel believed that this recapitulation was driven by evolution. But this view, while catchy and influential for a while, actually oversimplified things and led to some misconceptions. Well, it kind of ignored the complexity of biological diversity. The fact that evolution isn't a straight line, but more like a branching tree with different lineages diverging even in their early development. Earlier scientists, like Carl Ernst von Baer, had already recognized this, but Haeckel's idea of recapitulation kind of overshadowed those insights for a time.
So for a while, the focus shifted to the grand picture of evolution and inheritance, and the details of individual development got a bit lost.
Yeah, pretty much. But here's where things get really exciting. In recent decades, thanks to breakthroughs in molecular genetics and a renewed appreciation for just how complex development is, we've seen a huge resurgence of interest in the link between ontogeny and phylogeny.
That's interesting.
New fields like evolutionary developmental biology or Evo-Devo are exploring how changes in genes during evolution can actually alter developmental processes, leading to the incredible diversity of life we see. And this brings us right back to child development.
Okay, I see the connection.
There's a growing recognition that these fundamental biological insights are essential for understanding how children develop. For instance, understanding how changes in the timing of developmental events, like when a certain gene gets switched on or off, have driven evolutionary change in other species, can give us clues about the significance of similar timing shifts in human development.
That makes a lot of sense. So, with all this historical and biological context in mind, what are some of the specific aspects of child development we'll be exploring from these readings?
We're going to delve into the core of ontogenetic development, the development of the individual, and how this epigenetic process works, the interplay between genes and the environment.
Okay.
We'll look at how development itself plays a role in evolution and why interdisciplinary research, bringing together different fields like biology, psychology, and anthropology, is so crucial in this area. We'll touch on the foundational work of figures like Gesell and Piaget, and then dive into specific areas like motor skills, perception, social interactions, language acquisition, learning and memory, aggression, attention, and, of course, brain development.
Wow, that's a lot of ground to cover.
It is. And we'll also consider how factors like prematurity, blindness, and genetics can influence all of these processes.
So our mission then is to really give our listeners a much richer, more nuanced understanding of the intricate world of child development.
Exactly.
Fantastic. Well, let's dive right in. Let's start with this concept of ontogenetic development and the epigenetic process.
Yeah.
It seems like one of the core debates here, as we touched on, is the whole nature versus nurture question.
Absolutely. And Gilbert Gottlieb, in one of his papers, points out that there's actually a second fundamental question that goes hand in hand with the preformation versus epigenesis debate.
And what's that?
What actually causes development to happen? Like, what are the driving forces behind those changes we see?
That seems like a pretty basic question. You'd think we'd have a clear answer to that by now, right?
You'd think so, wouldn't you? But it's actually much more complex than it appears.
Okay, I'm intrigued.
So early experimental embryologists, folks like Wilhelm Roux, were really trying to pinpoint those causes. Roux is famous for this experiment he did on frog embryos.
What did he do?
He damaged one of the first two cells in the frog embryo and then observed that only half an embryo developed.
Oh, wow.
Right.
Oh.
And he interpreted this as evidence for what he called self-differentiation.
Self-differentiation.
Yeah, the idea that cells develop independently based on some kind of internal program, almost like they have their own little instruction manual.
Okay. But that wasn't the whole story, was it?
Not quite. Another scientist, Hans Driesch, came along and repeated a similar experiment, but instead of damaging a cell, he completely separated the two cells. And get this, each of those single cells developed into a complete embryo.
No way.
Yeah. It was a remarkable finding that showed cells weren't just following a rigid, pre-programmed script. Roux himself later acknowledged that the dying cell in his experiment had probably interfered with the healthy one, but his initial idea of self-differentiation versus dependent differentiation, where cells actually interact and influence each other's development, raised a really important causal distinction.
So Roux was thinking each cell was doing its own thing regardless of its neighbors, while Driesch showed they were more like a team working together.
Exactly. And Gottlieb argues that this distinction, self-differentiation versus dependent differentiation, still influences our thinking today, especially in that nature-nurture debate.
How so?
Well, self-differentiation tends to get linked with the idea of innate or hereditary outcomes, things that are predetermined, while dependent differentiation highlights the role of interaction and the environment in shaping development.
That connection to the nature-nurture debate makes perfect sense. It's like those early biological debates laid the foundation for how we think about psychological development, too.
Absolutely. And speaking of nature versus nurture, Gottlieb's work also talks about a shift away from what's known as the central dogma of molecular biology.
Which is?
This idea of a one-way flow of information from DNA to RNA to protein, genes dictating everything.
Right.
He proposes this concept of probabilistic epigenesis, which is a crucial shift for understanding modern developmental thinking.
Probabilistic epigenesis. So it sounds like this moves beyond simple genetic determinism, the idea that our genes are our destiny.
Exactly. Instead of genes being a fixed blueprint, probabilistic epigenesis emphasizes a developmental system where influences flow in both directions.
Meaning,
Genes can affect each other and mRNA, but their activity is also shaped by processes at other levels, all the way up to the external environment. Development isn't a predetermined sequence, but rather a probabilistic one where various internal and external events play a critical role in shaping the outcomes.
so it's not just genes acting in isolation, but a constant back and forth with the environment at every stage of development.
Precisely. This has huge implications for how we understand everything from typical development to the origins of developmental disorders.
Now, you mentioned earlier this connection between ontogenetic development and evolution. How does the way an individual develops actually influence the course of evolution? That seems like a big leap.
It is a big leap, and it's a fascinating area that's seen a lot of progress recently. The traditional view, often called the modern synthesis in biology, is that evolution happens when changes in genes lead to changes in development, which then result in different physical traits, behaviors, and even psychological traits. So the genetic change is seen as the primary driver.
That makes sense intuitively. A mutation in the genetic code leads to a change in how an organism develops.
Right. But there's another, more recent idea gaining traction. This perspective suggests that the initial spark for evolutionary change can sometimes be a change in ontogenetic development that leads to a novel behavior. This new behavior can then create new interactions between the organism and its environment. And here's the key part. Those new environmental interactions can then unlock hidden possibilities for physical and physiological changes, sometimes even without any initial changes in the genes themselves.
Wait, so a new behavior can actually steer physical evolution over time? That's a really mind-blowing idea.
It is. The thinking is that a species' typical development holds this reservoir of genetic potential that isn't always expressed. Changes in developmental conditions, often triggered by those new behaviors, can activate previously silent genes, leading to new epigenetic processes and ultimately new anatomical or physiological features.
So it's not just a one-way street from genes to traits. Development itself can be a real driver of evolutionary change.
Exactly. This broader view is the foundation of fields like Evo-Devo, developmental evolutionary biology, and even approaches like dynamical systems theory. They're all trying to integrate how an individual develops with the grand sweep of biological evolution.
This shift in perspective really highlights why interdisciplinary research in child development is so crucial now, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Brian Hopkins' chapter on interdisciplinarity really drives this point home. He reminds us that the early pioneers in child development back in the 1930s, folks like Gazel, McGraw, and Piaget, all had this appreciation for the connection between individual development and biological evolution. And it really shaped their research questions.
So we're sort of coming full circle back to that integrated view.
In a way, yes. Hopkins emphasizes that true interdisciplinary research isn't just about having experts from different fields work on the same topic. It requires a shared language, a way to connect the specialized vocabulary of each discipline. He even gives examples of how concepts and theories have migrated across disciplines, like Darwin's theory of natural selection influencing animal breeding and then evolutionary biology, or Piaget's ideas about assimilation and accommodation, drawing an analogy with the digestive system.
That's a great analogy. It's not just about being in the same room, but truly understanding each other's perspectives and methods.
Exactly. And Hopkins also cautions us to be mindful of how we use metaphors in science.
Okay.
While metaphors can be helpful for explaining things, they can also lead to misunderstandings if they're not used carefully. The heart of effective interdisciplinary research goes back to that fundamental question. What are we actually trying to understand? Sometimes a single discipline provides the necessary tools, but when the question itself inherently crosses those disciplinary boundaries, then collaboration becomes essential. And understanding child development in all its complexity definitely demands that kind of broad perspective.
I completely agree. Speaking of those early pioneers, let's talk about Arnold Gesell. His work seems rooted in that appreciation for the link between ontogeny and phylogeny that we discussed.
Right.
What were some of his key contributions to the field?
Celia Moore's historical overview really details Gesell's significant contribution, particularly his focus on establishing normative, age-based benchmarks for developmental diagnosis. This led to his well-known Gesell developmental schedules, a series of tests designed to track typical development across various areas.
So these schedules were meant to tell you if a child was developing on schedule for for their age.
That was a primary goal, yes. Giesel wanted to identify potential signs of developmental delays as early as possible. But as we recognize today, his norms were based on observing and testing children mostly from middle-class families of North European ancestry, so that's a limitation.
Right.
He also intended his schedules to indicate a child's readiness for schooling, drawing on that embryological concept of competence, the idea that an organism is prepared to develop a particular skill at a specific stage.
But there was kind of tension in Gessel's work, wasn't there?
Yes, Hopkins points out this interesting tension between Gesell the theorist and Giesel the tester. On one hand, he articulated this comprehensive theory that aimed to capture the holistic development of the child. But on the other hand, his schedules seemed to break down development into these separate functional domains, maybe losing some of that integrated view. And while he talked about readiness for schooling, it wasn't always clear if that directly translated to readiness for learning in a broader sense.
So he provided valuable tools for assessing development, but his theoretical framework and how it connected to those tools weren't always perfectly aligned.
That's a fair assessment. Now, another giant in the field, whose work still shapes our understanding today, is Jean Piaget.
Right. He's famous for his stage theory of cognitive development, right?
Exactly. As Moore describes, Piaget proposed that psychological structures undergo a series of qualitative transformations over time, progressing through 4 distinct stages.
And those are?
Sensoromotor, pre-operational, concrete operational, and formal operational. Each stage represents a fundamentally different way of thinking, a different kind of psychological organization.
So he was saying that infants don't just think like smaller adults, their cognitive processes are qualitatively different.
Exactly, he famously argued that. And these stages form a hierarchical progression. Later stages build upon the achievements of earlier ones.
Okay.
Piaget also believed that this sequence was universal and unidirectional. Regardless of their cultural background, he argued that all children's thinking develops through these stages towards the endpoint of formal operations.
Interesting. But he also talked about décalage, right? That sounds like it might contradict the idea of a unified stage.
You're right. Décalage is the idea that specific cognitive abilities within a stage might develop at slightly different times.
Okay.
So there's some flexibility there. But despite those variations in timing, Piaget maintained that as children resolve conflicts between their cognitive subsystems, their overall psychological structures develop into increasingly broad and integrated systems.
So Piaget offered this grand theory of cognitive development, emphasizing these qualitative shifts in thinking across universal stages, even while acknowledging some variability in the timing of specific skills within those stages.
Exactly. Now, shifting gears a bit, let's consider motor development. How do infants learn to move and interact with their physical world?
Good question.
The Cambridge Encyclopedia has some great sections on this. One key aspect they highlight is the development of visually guided reaching.
Meaning?
Initially, around 6 months of age, reaching involves looking and reaching as somewhat separate actions.
They don't quite connect the two yet.
Right. But around 7 to 8 months, a crucial development happens. Infants develop what are called sensorimotor mappings.
Yeah, sensoromotor mappings.
Yeah, these mappings allow them to fully coordinate looking and reaching. So now they can reach to bring an object into their line of sight, or move their hand to follow a moving object they're watching.
That makes sense.
They can even navigate their reaches around obstacles. It's amazing to think about that moment when a baby finally coordinates their hand and eye, something we take for granted.
It is. And this ability continues to refine, right?
Yes, absolutely. Around 11 to 12 months, infants can actually coordinate 2 or more of these sensoromotor mappings into what's called a sensoromotor system.
A system of mappings.
Exactly. This allows for more complex exploration, like systematically experimenting with how to fit a toy through the bars of their crib or making it fall in different ways, like Piaget observed.
So it's a progression from those separate actions to coordinated movements and then to this kind of systematic investigation of their surroundings using those coordinated actions.
Precisely. And research by Fisher and his colleagues, described in the context of storytelling skills, illustrates this progression even further. They found that around 18 to 24 months, children can coordinate 2 sensoromotor systems into what they call a system of sensoromotor systems, which corresponds to a single mental representation.
A single mental representation.
Yes, and this is when they might use a doll, for example, to represent a single concrete action in a very simple story.
So that connection between motor development and the emergence of representational thought is fascinating. It suggests that these different areas of development are much more interconnected than we might initially think.
They are. And this interconnectedness is further supported by research looking at the underlying biological processes. Studies have found these discontinuities in brain development, like sudden spurts in EEG activity and head growth, that seem to coincide with the emergence of new psychological skills at various ages throughout infancy and childhood.
So these bursts of brain activity align with those leaps in both motor and cognitive abilities.
Exactly. It really points to this close interplay between biological maturation and the acquisition of new skills.
Now let's shift our attention to how infants begin to make sense of the world around them, their perceptual development.
Okay.
What are some of the key milestones in this area?
The readings highlight that infants are actually born with a surprisingly sophisticated set of perceptual abilities.
Oh, really?
Yeah. For example, newborns can turn their heads and smoothly track a moving object, suggesting that this ability to stabilize their gaze is already present even before birth.
Interesting.
They can also distinguish between some colors and have some sensitivity to contrast, although these abilities do improve significantly in the first few months. For instance, visual acuity, the sharpness of vision, is only about 5% of adult levels at birth.
So while they can see, their vision is still pretty blurry compared to ours.
Right. But they're actively engaging with the visual world from the very start. Research using habituation techniques, where you basically see how long infants look at something before they get bored, suggests they have some basic expectations about how the physical world works, even very early on. For example, studies on numerical identity show that by 3 to 4 months, infants seem to have some awareness of the number of objects that should be involved in a particular event.
That's pretty advanced for such young babies. It really challenges the old view of them as passive recipients of sensory information.
It does. And as they develop, their perceptual abilities become even more refined, and they start to perceive more complex relationships between things. Within the first year, infants begin to perceive things like illusory contours, causality, object unity, and even biological motion.
Can you explain those a bit more?
Sure. Illusory contours are those shapes that our brain perceives, even though there's no actual line or boundary there. It's like our brain fills in the gaps. Causality is understanding that one event causes another, like a ball hitting another ball and making it move. Object unity is understanding that parts of an object moving together behind a screen are actually connected, even though you can't see the whole object. And biological motion is the ability to perceive the movement of living things as distinct from the movement of inanimate objects.
Wow, so they're really starting to put the pieces together and make sense of their visual world.
Absolutely. They're actively constructing their understanding of the world through their sensory experiences.
Now let's move into the social world. How do children develop social understanding and build relationships?
Well, the sources really emphasize that children are active participants in their social development right from the beginning.
Okay.
They form different types of relationships with family, with friends, with peers, and each of these relationships plays a unique role in shaping their social behavior, their attitudes, their beliefs.
Right.
It's the dynamic of the relationship itself, not just the individual traits of the people involved, that's a key factor in social development.
So the dynamics within a friendship group might teach different social lessons than the dynamics within a family.
Exactly. And by the end of that first year, infants display a whole range of emotions, expressed through distinct facial expressions that are appropriate for different situations.
Right.
These emotions serve as vital signals for social communication, as well as indicators of their internal psychological states. And their emotional development is closely tied to their caregiving environment and the responses they receive from others. In the following year, these emotions become even more differentiated as a sense of self begins to emerge.
And how early do infants begin to understand the emotions of others?
Good question. Research suggests that infants can discriminate between emotions in faces and voices in the second half of their first year. Whether they truly grasp the meaning of those emotional expressions at that age is still debated.
I can see why that would be hard to determine.
Yeah. Some studies use static facial images, while others use more dynamic presentations involving both facial and vocal cues, which seem to improve infants' ability to differentiate between emotions.
Okay.
However, it's possible they're responding to differences in acoustic or visual cues rather than a deep understanding of the emotion itself.
So emotional awareness is a gradual process, moving from that basic discrimination to a more nuanced understanding of meaning.
That's the current thinking. Another crucial aspect of social development is the development of morality.
Right.
Research indicates that by age 5 or 6, children can distinguish between moral rules and conventional rules.
So the difference between something that's inherently wrong, like hurting someone, versus something that's just a rule because someone said so, like wearing a uniform to school.
Exactly. And this is significant because it suggests that their moral reasoning isn't solely based on obedience to adult authority or fear of punishment.
Right.
They seem to have a developing understanding of fairness and the different roles of authority figures in moral versus non-moral situations.
That's encouraging. It suggests that even young children have a sense of right and wrong that goes beyond simply following rules.
Indeed. Now let's talk about that uniquely human capacity.
Yeah.
Language. How do children go from making those early sounds to constructing complex sentences?
That's a fascinating question.
Celia Moore's historical overview points out that developmental biology provided the initial framework for developmental psychology in the late 19th century. And language development has always been a central focus within this field. One of the most remarkable aspects of speech development, as highlighted in one of the chapters, is the incredibly precise timing and coordination required, likely more so than for any other motor act.
Wow.
And these motor skills have to become linked to the intricate structure of language itself.
It's truly amazing how rapidly children acquire language. What are some of the key stages in that early speech development?
Well, the readings outline a fascinating progression. Even before birth, the human ear is well developed by around 5 months of gestation.
So they can already hear sounds in the womb.
Yes,
Yeah.
including the mother's voice. After birth, in the first 6 months, infants produce a range of vocalizations, but the ratio of vowels to consonants is high.
Okay.
Then between 6 and 10 months, we see this transition to more complex sound patterns that might foreshadow early words. The vowel to consonant ratio decreases, and babbling becomes richer with a greater variety of consonants.
It's like they're experimenting with sounds.
Exactly. And interestingly, in the early part of this period, there's this striking similarity in the sounds produced by infants across different language environments. Research shows that infants tend to produce bilabial sounds like PBM and alveolar sounds like PEN.
So there's a kind of universal babbling stage before infants start to specialize in the sounds of their own language.
That's the general idea. Around 10 to 14 months, infants typically utter their first words, often simple nouns referring to familiar objects or people. Then their vocabulary expands pretty rapidly.
Right.
And the development of grammar and syntax follows, with children gradually combining words into phrases and sentences. The readings also touch on the development of phonological awareness.
Phonological awareness.
Yeah, that's the ability to reflect on the sound structure of words, which is crucial for learning to read.
Makes sense. Now, what about learning and memory? How do these cognitive abilities develop in early childhood?
Research using operant conditioning techniques, like the mobile conjugate reinforcement paradigm for infants aged 2 to 6 months and the train paradigm for older infants, has given us a really detailed understanding of how learning and memory change in those first 18 months of life.
Okay.
These studies demonstrate that even very young infants can learn associations between their actions and what happens in their environment, and they can retain those memories for longer periods as they get older.
So even very young babies can remember things.
Absolutely. However, their ability to retrieve those memories is often highly dependent on the context.
Meaning?
For example, one study found that 9-month-olds showed no memory in a deferred imitation task if they saw the demonstration in the lab and were then tested at home.
So the change in environment disrupted their memory.
Exactly. Whereas 12-month-olds were more resilient to that change in environment. As infants mature, they become better at recalling memories in a wider range of situations and applying what they've learned to new but similar objects.
And what about childhood amnesia, the fact that we adults typically can't recall memories from before the age of 3?
That's a fascinating phenomenon. Research on memory development suggests that those basic memory processes are actually continuous across development. The changes we see with age are mainly in how long a memory can be held and the variety of cues that can trigger its retrieval.
Okay.
So it's not that babies aren't forming memories, it's more about how those memories are stored and accessed.
Right.
Childhood amnesia has been attributed to several factors, including the immaturity of the declarative memory system, the development of a sense of self, and the development of language as a way to organize and access those memories. It's likely a combination of these factors that contributes to this lack of early autobiographical memories.
Now let's talk about a more challenging aspect of development, aggression. What does the research tell us about how aggressive behaviors emerge and change over time?
Research on aggression, especially physical aggression, reveal some really interesting developmental patterns. Longitudinal studies have shown that the frequency of physical aggression actually tends to peak in early childhood and then decline with age for most individuals.
So it's not a steady increase as kids get older.
Nope. And interestingly, boys tend to exhibit more frequent physical aggression than girls on average. This decline with age isn't fully explained by traditional social learning theories, which might predict an increase due to greater exposure to models of aggression.
So it's not just about learning to be aggressive. There might be some inherent developmental patterns at play.
That's what the research suggests. These longitudinal studies also indicate that it's pretty unusual for a child who hasn't been highly physically aggressive in the past to suddenly develop significant problems with physical aggression later on.
Interesting.
From a developmental perspective, children seem to learn with age to help others and inhibit physical aggression. Those who don't develop this inhibition are at higher risk of social exclusion.
Right, because aggression can damage relationships.
It's exactly. While individual differences in aggression and prosocial behavior tend to be relatively stable over time, even highly prosocial individuals might resort to aggression when necessary. And those with a history of aggression can also display prosocial behaviors. Many risk factors for aggression have been identified, but establishing clear cause and effect relationships has been challenging due to the ethical difficulties of conducting experimental studies in this area.
Of course, it's a sensitive area of research. Now let's consider another important aspect of cognitive development: attention. How does the ability to focus and sustain attention develop in children?
Well, the development of sustained attention during infancy is closely tied to the maturation of brain systems that regulate arousal and alertness.
Okay.
Between 3 and 12 months, as sustained attention improves, there's a corresponding decrease in how long infants look at simple visual patterns.
So as they get better at focusing, they get bored with simple things more quickly.
Yeah, that's one interpretation. This change has been seen as indicating an increase in the speed at which they process information. At the same time, infants start to look longer at more complex and varied visual or auditory visual patterns.
So they're drawn to more stimulating things.
Exactly. And the readings also discuss the development of different types of attention.
Like?
Sustained attention, which is the ability to maintain focus over time, and executive attention, which involves those higher-level control processes like planning and inhibiting responses.
Right, like resisting distractions and staying on task.
Exactly. These different types of attention rely on different brain regions and develop at different rates. And this all relates to conditions like ADHD, right?
Yes, ADHD is often characterized by difficulties with attention. And the readings mention different subtypes of ADHD: inattentive, hyperactive, and combined. There's this hypothesis that these subtypes might be related to differences in the underlying attention systems in the brain. For example, the hyperactive subtype has been linked to difficulties with executive functions and potential differences in the prefrontal cortex, while the inattentive subtype may be more associated with differences in sustained attention and related brain regions.
So understanding the typical development of attention can really help us understand the neurological basis of attentional disorders.
Exactly. Now, we can't have a deep dive into child development without talking about the brain itself. What are some key aspects of brain development during childhood?
Brain development in childhood is this amazingly dynamic and extended process. It involves this complex interaction of genetic factors and environmental experiences.
Right.
While some basic sensory and motor functions depend on subcortical brain regions that mature relatively early, the cerebral cortex, which is responsible for those higher-level cognitive functions, undergoes significant development throughout childhood and even into adolescence.
So different parts of the brain mature at different rates.
They do.
Yeah.
And the timing of this maturation can have really important implications for behavior.
How so?
For instance, while directing gaze and shifting attention are present shortly after birth and mainly involve subcortical circuits, the cortical processing of visual information continues to develop in those first few years after birth.
Okay.
Similarly,